Europe. I mean, just say the word and so many images flood your mind, right? Ancient ruins and vibrant cities, a whole continent steeped in history and culture.
Yeah.
What is Europe really? Like
Right.
at its core,
Yeah.
it's got to be more than just borders on a map.
It is. It really is. And honestly, that's what we're diving into today. This whole idea of Europe, not like a straight up history lesson, but more about exploring the essence of it, the core concept.
Yeah, like the big picture stuff, the underlying themes that have shaped how people think about Europe over time.
Exactly. And to help us unpack all of this, we're turning to historical analyses and the perspectives of some pretty influential thinkers, really trying to distill this complex idea down to its most crucial elements, just to give you a solid foundation.
Sounds good. So where do we even begin with this whole European idea thing? Like, where did it even sprout from?
Well, the term Europe itself goes way back, and in some of its earliest forms, it was basically interchangeable with Hellas, which is basically ancient Greece.
So right from the start, it's tied to this idea of the birthplace of Western civilization, huh?
Pretty much. But as the centuries went by, the meaning shifted. Take Charlemagne's empire, for instance. There, the idea of Europe became super intertwined with Christianity. This religious dimension was then amplified during events like the Siege of Vienna. It became Christendom, defending itself against the Ottoman Empire.
So for those listening, it seems like a key early element of the European idea was this shared cultural and religious heritage, especially when pitted against those perceived as outsiders.
Exactly. It's about belonging, right? But things took an interesting turn in the 19th century with someone named Schmidt-Fieseldek. He brought a fresh perspective.
Okay, what did this Schmidt-Fieseldek guy bring to the table?
He was Conrad George von Schmidt-Fieseldek, actually. And he kind of moved beyond these earlier religious and geographic ideas of Europe. He started thinking about it more in terms of global power and economic relationships. What's really fascinating is he was worried about the rise of the United States.
Makes sense. New kid on the block and all that.
Right. And he was saying that European unity wasn't just a nice idea for peace and welfare. Those were already common goals. No, he thought it was essential. Europe needed to stick together on the world stage to counterbalance this rising American power. So the European idea gets this new geopolitical and economic layer.
Internal drivers like peace and welfare, then external pressures pile on. Almost like the idea of Europe is constantly being molded by what's happening around it. Like that
Yeah.
time Napoleon's blockade unintentionally pushed Europe towards more cooperation. It's like this underlying current, right? Wanting stability, prosperity, some form of unity. It keeps popping up.
Definitely. And speaking of stability, this was front and center at the Congress of Vienna in 1814.
After the Napoleonic Wars. Makes sense. Everyone's exhausted.
Exactly. They were all about establishing a lasting peace, this idea of a balance of Europe.
Yeah.
It's really where this concept of Europe as a system of interconnected states working together for equilibrium really takes shape. And get this, Beethoven even wrote a cantata celebrating this glorious moment of potential European harmony.
Wow. So that desire for a peaceful, cooperative European order, that's a pretty big takeaway for our listeners, right?
Yeah.
But then the 19th century rolls around, and with it, this surge of strong national identities.
Yeah.
So how did that fit in with the idea of a unified Europe? Did those two things clash?
Well, there was definitely a tension there, for sure. Thinkers like August Wilhelm Schlegel, he basically saw Europe as potentially becoming this one large nation, one big entity. But on the other hand, you had someone like Germaine de Stael. She was all about the unique character and importance of individual nations.
So one big happy family versus celebrating individual quirks, basically.
Yeah, you could put it that way. But the interesting thing is, for many, these weren't mutually exclusive ideas. Like Giuseppe Mazzini, he saw nationality as a kind of European division of labor, where each nation brought its own unique strengths to the table for the benefit of a greater European whole.
Ah, so not necessarily one or the other, more like different layers of identity coexisting.
Precisely. But then there's this other element, this tendency to define Europe by contrasting it with something else, this idea of an East.
Okay, so like an us versus them kind of thing.
It's more nuanced than that, but yeah. The concept of Europe starts to solidify in contrast to this imagined East, often symbolized by Russia. And this East was frequently portrayed as less developed, lacking those freedoms and advancements that were, attributed to the West.
So some bias creeping in there.
Oh, absolutely. Thinkers like Richard Cobden and Henri Martin really pushed this distinction. They presented Western Europe as this beacon of enlightenment compared to a supposedly autocratic and less developed East. It was a way of solidifying a shared identity among the nations of Western Europe.
This West versus East dynamic is definitely a powerful image. And right around this time, this whole concept of civilization becomes really entwined with the idea of Europe, right?
You got it. Civilization as a concept pops up in the late 18th century, and it quickly becomes linked to this European identity. At first, it was like this universal ideal, something any society could strive for. But then, as we move into the 19th century, it becomes a way to describe Europe specifically, something that sets it apart.
And I bet there were different opinions on what exactly this European civilization looked like.
Oh, for sure. Like Francois Guizot, he was all about Christianity and what he called the spirit of liberty, this unique interplay between these forces shaping European societies. But then Shami Balmes, he came from a more Catholic perspective. He argued that the unity of European civilization was fractured because of Protestantism.
So some disagreement about the recipe for European civilization.
Exactly. And to add to that, Juan Andres threw a real curveball. He said European civilization was heavily indebted to Arabic intellectual and cultural contributions.
So really different views on the very foundation of what this European civilization even was.
That's the thing, even the core characteristics were up for debate. And then, bam, the 20th century hits with those devastating world wars. Talk about a game changer for the European idea.
Yeah, those wars must have really shaken things up.
It was huge. On the one hand, the First World War ignited this intense wave of nationalism. It deepened divisions across the continent like never before. And ideas like a German-led Middle Europa started gaining traction. This principle of national self-determination, it became super powerful, especially with empires collapsing in Central and Eastern Europe.
So the war was both divisive and a catalyst for new political ideas.
Yeah, it was a complex time, and the sheer scale of destruction, the loss of life, it led to renewed calls for European unity. Many thinkers, regardless of their political leanings, started to see that this intense nationalism was ultimately self-destructive.
So they realized they needed some form of European cooperation to avoid another catastrophe.
Exactly. So you see, for our listeners, this war, this terrible tragedy, it both shattered and revitalized this dream of a united Europe.
A unity forged from such immense division. Talk about a heavy concept.
Mhm.
And then between the wars, there was this explosion of proposals for European unification, right? Like the crisis really fueled the fire.
Oh, absolutely. Between the wars, there was this pervasive feeling of crisis and decline in Europe. Economic instability, social unrest, and this sense that Europe was losing its global standing. And this atmosphere really gave rise to tons of plans and movements all pushing for European unification.
So unite or fall apart.
It was a major theme, and one of the most famous was Count Richard von Coudenhove-Kalergi's Pan-Europe movement. He was advocating for a political and economic federation of European states. His big argument was that only through unity could Europe compete globally and avoid another devastating war.
So the idea was to band together to avoid repeating history.
Mhm.
And then World War II happens, an even bigger catastrophe. Did that finally push Europe toward a more concrete form of integration?
World War II was the ultimate catalyst. The desire for lasting peace was just overwhelming. And there was this really stark realization that Europe was severely weakened on the world stage. The US and the Soviet Union were the new power players.
So New World Order.
It was a wake-up call. And then the Congress of Europe in 1948, that was a pivotal moment. Leaders and thinkers come together to figure out a way forward. And there's this growing consensus that sharing sovereignty, cooperating economically, that's essential for Europe's future. The focus shifts to practical steps toward integration, sharing resources, boosting trade, those sorts of things.
So concrete action after the horrors of World War II. But even with these steps toward unity, I imagine the question of national identities, those cultural differences, they remained a big factor, right?
Right. This whole post-war era is full of discussions and debates about European identity. It's this constant back and forth, the desire for greater unity versus the importance of individual cultures and traditions. You have thinkers like Ernst Jünger. He talked about this unity of organization with a diversity of national cultures. His point was that political and economic integration didn't have to mean erasing national identities.
So unity but not uniformity.
Yeah, exactly. And Salvador de Madariaga, he was a big proponent of diversity and unity. He thought the richness of European culture came from its variety. And then there were intellectuals like Denis de Rougemont and Stephen Spender. They stressed how shared intellectual and cultural values could nurture this sense of belonging to Europe. So the challenge then and now is how to build a unified Europe that also embraces its internal diversity.
This unity and diversity idea keeps coming up.
Mm.
And as the EU develops, I'm guessing these questions about what it meant to be European in this new context, they didn't just disappear, did they?
Not at all. As European integrations deepened, defining European identity became even more central. Figures like Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, he leaned toward a historical definition, rooted in the shared heritage of ancient Greece and Rome, plus Judeo-Christian traditions. But some felt that was a bit exclusionary.
Too narrow a definition for some.
Exactly. And others argued for a more inclusive and adaptable definition, one that recognizes the contributions of diverse cultures and stays open to change.
That makes sense.
And even more recently, these worries about Europe's place in the world have resurfaced. It's fueled debates about the fundamental values and the shared identity that should drive the European project. It's a dynamic process, always evolving.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's pretty clear that the European idea isn't some fixed concept. It's been molded by history, by philosophical debates, by this constant push and pull between the desire for unity and the strength of national identities. From its ancient roots to the modern EU, it's an idea that's been in constant flux.
Absolutely. We've seen how the idea of Europe has shifted and transformed. From a basic geographical term to one loaded with religious significance, then to this political aspiration fueled by peace and prosperity, and later shaped by the rise of nations and the need to adapt to global power shifts. And the concept of a shared European civilization, with all its debates about its origins and characteristics, that's been a recurring thread throughout. And then, of course, the 20th century with those devastating wars. Ultimately, it was those events that propelled the continent toward integration. But even then, figuring out how to balance unity and diversity, that's an ongoing conversation.
So for everyone listening, understanding this journey of the European idea, it gives you this really important framework for making sense of the complexities of Europe today. Those debates we see about European integration, national identity, Europe's global role, they're not new. They're part of this long, ongoing conversation about what Europe really means.
And it begs the question, what do you think? What are the most crucial elements of the European idea for the future? How can we use this understanding of history to navigate the challenges and opportunities facing Europe today? It's a question that will continue to shape the future of the continent.